All right, so this morning we are going to talk about some tables, and I'm going to share with you some tables that have been important in my life. So I thought you could think about a table that you have in your life. Maybe there is an heirloom table that has been passed down from generation to generation. Maybe you just purchased a brand new table that you love so much. Maybe it's a small table that you had a long time ago, or a TV dinner table. Something that has meaning and that has great memories. And think about that today. And we've already heard a little bit from Joy and from Shannon about our passage today, but let's go together to the Gospel of Luke as we talk about these two disciples on the road to Emmaus. It says, now that same day, two of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place." In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen visions of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe that all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went and stayed with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon." Then the two of them told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. This is the word of the Lord. So 22 years ago, I bought my first kitchen table. My husband Sean and I were just married, and we were given a gift certificate with instructions to go buy our table for our apartment. And we were visiting my parents before we were about to move to California from Washington. And so we took that gift certificate and headed to the store, and we purchased a very basic but super solid wood table and 4 chairs for $100. I know, it's pretty amazing. So we loaded it, still in the box, into our U-Haul in Washington State and drove to California and unloaded it, put it together into our first apartment in Fresno. We ate our first meals as a married couple around this table, and we made lifelong friends sharing simple meals at that table. And our family grew around that table. And even after we had a space for a formal dining room, we still had that kitchen table in our kitchen, and it saw a lot of life. Art projects and sticky fingers and cookie making, homework and lots of birthday celebrations. The top finish of that table became so worn down after years of scrubbing and disinfecting that once when my dad was visiting, he helped me sand and seal a crack and refinish the top of that table, giving it new life. The table has moved across the country with us several different times, and it's been set up in many apartments and many houses. Several years ago, when we moved to Illinois, we had a big dining room, but no space in our kitchen for a table. We also had a walk-up attic in that big old 100-year-old home. And so the kitchen table was put together in the attic for the kids and their play space. It was filled with Legos and art projects and many other things there. That table currently sits wrapped in one of those thick moving blankets in our garage because we only have space for one table in our current house. But we couldn't get rid of it, even though it's been sitting there for 3 years. Because it's solid, it's filled with memories, and it still really has a lot of life left in it. I have dreams of refinishing it one day and sitting around it again. There were a lot of meals shared at that table, and sins were confessed, and tears were shed. And together, my husband and I remembered what God had done in our lives and how he had provided for us and how he was going to provide again for our future. There were a lot of prayers, and it just continues to remind us of God's goodness and love and provision. For most of us, a table, usually a kitchen table, serves as kind of the center gathering space in our lives. I think if you have people over, often you think everyone's going to hang out in your living room, but they end up migrating towards the kitchen or sitting at your kitchen table while you're getting things ready. We eat our meals there. We pay our bills at the table. We do homework. We share stories of our lives at our tables. And each table is unique. Some are heirlooms that are passed down from generation to generation. Some are new. Some are larger than the previous ones we might have had. And, you can get more people around them. Some are temporary tables, maybe a folding table that you put a tablecloth on to make it look nice. Some are handcrafted with love and care when they're built, and others are put together with like those little picture instructions from IKEA. And some are just small enough to hold a plate and a glass. When space is made for us at someone's table, when we are welcomed and space is set just for us, it can become transformative. Something happens, I think, when we sit around a table together and share food, and it can be as simple or as fancy as you like. When we sit around a table, we're no longer alone. We are loved and accepted. We become known and we get to know others. The table is a place where food is passed and jokes are heard and laughter happens, but also where our hearts are healed. You see, God calls us to what I like to call radical hospitality. And it isn't scary and it's not intimidating. It's simply making space for others and welcoming them in. And the entire Bible, and especially the gospel, is a story of God's hospitality and that we get to be the guests. And we're welcomed at the table. We're welcomed by God's grace. You see, Jesus came to reconcile us with God, and so much of the Gospels are centered around this table or a meal. It was once said that Jesus was always on his way to a meal, at a meal, or leaving a meal, which is true when you read the Gospels. He sat down with a lot of people. And N.T. Wright, who I love, he's an author and a scholar, he said, when Jesus himself wanted to explain to his disciples what his forthcoming death was all about, he didn't give them a theory. He gave them a meal. So it's no surprise that Jesus shows up at a meal following his resurrection. And in our text from Luke 24, we find these two disciples. They're just regular disciples. One is unnamed, and one is named, but we never hear his name again. They're just regular people like us. And they are probably the most disappointed they have ever been in their entire lives. And they have lost all hope because all of their hopes and their dreams were nailed to a cross. But coming to a table restores hope. In verse 13, we find them on the road to Emmaus, where they lived, and they were most likely returning from Jerusalem at the Passover feast. And they're having a conversation about all these things that have just taken place around Jesus' crucifixion. And these things are obviously weighing very heavy on their hearts. And while they're walking along, Jesus draws alongside them. And we don't know why, but they're not able to recognize him. And after walking for a bit and Jesus listening to them, he asks them why they are sad and what they are talking about. And they do not understand how he did not know what had been going on. And they say, haven't you heard about Jesus and his crucifixion? Don't you know what's going on? And the men explained everything that they knew about Jesus. But of course, they still had questions, especially about what was going to happen next now that he was gone. In verse 21, it says, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They had hope, and it had been lost. And then Jesus goes on to tell them everything in the scriptures and everything that it said from him, starting with Moses through all the prophets. And I think what an amazing Bible study that would have been on this long walk home, that they got to hear those words from Jesus. And as they arrived, it looked like Jesus was going to continue on, but the disciples invite him for a meal. And it's the word that's used is almost like implore, like they grabbed him. Maybe their hearts were burning, like it says, because they could hear what he was saying. And they said, no, you have to stay with us. Come, have a meal. And so he came inside and they sat down to something that was probably a very simple meal of the time. And during that meal, Jesus took the bread and he gave thanks and he broke it and he gave it to them. And in that moment, everything changed. The disappointment that these disciples were feeling literally evaporated in the presence of the risen Christ. You see, coming to the table restores hope. Jesus is the great restorer of life and the creator of new beginnings. And God is faithful even when we can't imagine it, just like those disciples. Coming to the table changes us. So if you've been reading or just following along with our book from John Maxwell this summer, Change Your World, you'll notice that we talk a lot about change. And I want to read you a section from his chapter talking about coming to the table. He says this: the table doesn't have to be a literal table. Anywhere where 3 or more people are willing to get together and get honest. At transformation tables, that's what he likes to call them, people who desire to improve their lives gather together. And then he has a list of things that happen. He says new relationships are formed, beliefs are discovered, perspective is shared, discussion gives help, answers are found, trust is given, vulnerability is appreciated, values are practiced, good habits are formed, self-worth is increased, broken relationships are restored, servanthood is lived, generosity is shown, courage is activated, and lives are changed. He also says that you might be able to impress people from a distance, but you can only impact them from up close. He says that transformation is personal. It's relational. In order for our lives to be changed, we need to gather in community, and we need to answer Christ's invitation to the table. You see, we've already been invited, and we can approach through God's grace that has been given to us. And we can do it by saying yes. We are the ones who get distracted, but we just need to listen to that knock at the door, the knock on our hearts, and say yes to the Lord. When we come to the table, the communion table, we are changed as well. We come to the table but this is the act of the Spirit that we are changed, not by what we do. In Ephesians 2:8 it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not from yourselves, but is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." We engage in the transcended God now, for God is always present, always present, and he draws us into his presence, and we get to connect with those who have gone before us and those have yet to come, and those that we long to bring with us to that table. Communion is a spiritual nourishment for what we are about to endure, and Christ's meal sends us out into the world. We don't stay at the table. We go out. It's God's saving grace. He's already accomplished it. In communion, it's the sealing act of that. And God says, come to my table, be restored, and be made new. This is a change that happens, and it only happens through the power of the Holy Spirit and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And that's the change we all desire. Coming to the table teaches us how to love one another. The book of Acts is the beginning of the Christian church, and Jesus has ascended into heaven, and he has sent the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. And more people are starting to follow and converting to Christianity. And the community of believers is growing and growing. And here is how it says that they loved one another. This is Acts 2. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. They followed God and they lived in community, and they shared meals together, praising God. They shared God with each other and with others. And this is how they loved one another. Now, when they would sit down to a meal, they both would have a regular dinner together, but it was their practice to celebrate what we call communion at that meal. So when it says they sat down and broke bread together, it is both a common dinner meal, but also a remembrance of God. And they did that every time that they gathered. Coming to the table brings healing and wholeness. So in the spring of 2020, any attempt at hospitality or inviting others into our homes or around our tables came to an abrupt halt. For everyone's safety, we closed our front doors and we waved at people from a distance. For some families, this forced shutdown actually brought them together at their dining tables. There's a statistic that before COVID, that only about 30% of families actually ate dinner together. And this doesn't mean like 5 or 6 nights a week. This was like maybe 3 nights a week. It was only 30% because our busy schedules got in the way. But this forced quarantine forced those families to sit together. And so while some families found more time around a table and maybe more connection, for other people, it brought a lot of isolation because we weren't with each other. So after months of not getting together with anyone, we had some dear friends who invited us over for a social distance backyard dinner. And we stayed outside. We walked around their house to the backyard, and they had a long table, and our place settings were at one end, and their place settings were at the other. And I remember it being cold, and they had one of those tabletop little fire pits that kind of kept us warm, and the food was warm, and of course that conversation was warm. And the following month, we opened our backyard and long table to them, sitting at opposite ends again. And these 2 really simple meals together were healing for our souls because we had not sat across a table from anyone for months besides our close family. And those conversations that we had about life, about what had been going on, about our families and our kids, and what the future might be, brought wholeness. You see, when God healed people in the Bible, he healed them physically, and then he restored them to wholeness. The result of that physical healing was that they were brought into community because that physical ailment kept them isolated from everyone else. They were on the outskirts. They were outside the gates. They were alone. And I think their greatest suffering was that isolation. So God healed them physically, and he made them whole again. And this is what coming to the table does for us. We are made whole again. Coming to the table creates community, connection, and belonging. My husband and I spent 3 years at Princeton while he attended seminary. It's where Elise was born and lifelong friendships were made. We arrived in the summer with a smaller group of students, of course not knowing anyone, meeting everybody as we unloaded our moving trucks and moved in. So the first Friday that we were there, we decided that we would have a cookout in front of our apartments. And we all brought whatever food we could to share, and we shared our first meal. And these Friday night cookouts became a weekly tradition. And sometimes people couldn't bring a lot of food because they didn't have a lot. And some people couldn't bring anything. But we all brought what we could, and it ended up a giant feast every time. We would just pull picnic tables together. When it got colder, we would head inside someone's apartment and pack around those dining tables or sit on the floors together. And those tables were open to whoever wanted to join us. We just made more room. We celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and new babies and first birthdays and new jobs and celebrated passing classes and ordination exams. We also had loss and heartache, and we prayed deeply for each other. We had those Friday night dinners for 3 years, every Friday. We are yearning for connection, and we have a deep desire to belong. And I'm sure that you can recall a time where you felt left out or uninvited. I think sharing a meal nourishes our need to know each other because it facilitates face-to-face conversation. I've heard it said that you should try to buy a round dining table if it fits in your space, like round tables here, because you're forced to look at each other instead of look down the long table at who is there. But there's something about that face-to-face conversation. You know, we're in this digital world where we kind of connect to each other through our phones and our devices, through Facebook posts and Instagram, and we have more online friends than in-person friends. And this ability to connect is so important for those of us who don't live near family. It is such a blessing to me to have those connections. But it also, I think, hinders our face-to-face connections because picking up your phone is so much easier and faster. The gospel and all of the scriptures reinforce the truth that we were created for community. God did not create us to live in isolation, but to be in community with others. It was part of his perfect plan. As Christians, one of the ways we get to live out this community is here by belonging to a church. But the church is something much greater because of what Christ did for us. In the New Testament, this relationship that we're talking about is called koinonia, and it's a Greek word, and it means fellowship. And it means that we as Christians have communion with one another, and we get to participate in life together. And not only that, but we have communion with Christ, and we get to participate in his life and his mission because we're members of his body. I think when our community gathers around a table, our hope is restored, and we learn how to love each other. We are healed and brought into wholeness, and our lives are really changed. The table is a place where food is passed and jokes are told and laughter is heard and where our hearts can be healed. Jesus invited people to tables again and again, and their eyes were opened and their lives were changed. And I believe our lives are changed today too, and often that happens around a simple table. And so as a church, we are inviting you to join us around tables.